Hello, my name is Lloyd Chapman, and I'm the president and founder of the American Small Business League. And today I'm going to show you with some simple math how the federal government has cheated middle-class small businesses out of about, I'll say $1 trillion in the last 5 years, and probably over $2 trillion, maybe $2.5 trillion in the last 10 years. All right? So let me start with my first thing, number one. Federal law today says that small business shall receive a minimum of 23% of the total value of all federal contracts. And that's based on the Small Business Act of 1953. So Congress has made that 23%. So that's irrefutable. That's not a conspiracy theory, so we're good there, right? Number two, in the Small Business Act and in federal regulations, it says that the highest size standard for a small business is 1,500 employees. That's it. It also says this, federal law says that in determining a company's status as a small business, you must include the number of employees of any parent company or subsidiaries, right? So that's a fact. That's not a conspiracy theory, right? I challenge anyone to show me a federal small business size standard that's higher than 1,500. It's certainly not 10 and 20,000 like we're seeing with some of these Fortune 500 firms that are getting billions in small business contracts. Let's talk about number three now. The total federal budget for 2015 was right around $3.8 trillion. It might have been $3.7 trillion, but I believe it's right around $3.8 trillion, okay? So that's a fact. Now here's one where there's some disagreement. I say that the federal acquisition budget is $1.2 trillion. I've seen a number of stories that say, I've seen three stories from reputable journalists that said the Pentagon budget, the Pentagon spends $1.2 trillion. I take it back. They said that America spends $1.2 trillion on defense. Okay, that's just on defense. That doesn't count NASA and the FBI and the Justice Department and the Forestry Service and things like that. So, and luckily for me, I have one of the nation's leading experts on federal contracting law, Professor Charles Tiefer, issued a legal opinion about 18 months ago that agrees with me that based upon federal law, that the number that should be used in calculating the 23% is 1.2 trillion. Okay? And I think it's reasonable to assume that if the total federal budget is 3.8 trillion, that about 1.2 that's spent on acquisitions would be about right. The Small Business Administration, in calculating the percentage of awards to small business, has tried to tell us for a decade that the federal acquisition budget is somewhere below $400 billion. So the SBA is trying to convince us, and quite frankly, I would say has convinced most people in media, that the federal acquisition budget is slightly more than 10% of the total federal budget. I think that's ridiculous. So I can't imagine anybody believes that. So the truth is the federal acquisition budget is about 1.2 trillion because that's just what we spend on defense. So let's just say, so federal law says small business shall receive a minimum of 23%. The size standards, the highest one is I think 1,500 employees. And the total federal budget is 3.8 trillion. The acquisition budget is 1.2. 23% of 1.2 trillion is 276 billion. That's what small business should get by law. The highest number I've ever seen in my lifetime that the SBA says small business has received was about 90 billion. And when you looked at that 90 billion, most of the money went to Fortune 500 firms and big businesses. So by the way, the one funny thing the SBA does is they don't tell you what they're using for an acquisition budget, but you can figure it out, by dividing, if you've got that they say that 23% equals, 90 billion, when you do the math, it shows they're using about 391 as their acquisition budget, or sub 400 billion, right? So they've done this little trick for 15 years. Again, luckily for me, I've got Public Citizen issued a report about a year ago called Slighted that accuses the FDA of using these little math tricks to cheat small businesses. So Public Citizen agrees with me. Professor Charles Tiefer, the nation's leading expert on federal contracting law, agrees with me. And a number of journalists, including some people that have worked on the Senate Armed Services Committee, agree that the Pentagon's spending $1.2 trillion. So clearly it's conservative. I want to say that again. It's conservative to say that the federal acquisition budget is a minimum of $1.2 trillion. So small business should be getting $276 billion. The most that the government has ever claimed was 90, and there have been over 100 stories in the press that have shown that most of that money goes to Fortune 500 firms. For FY 2015, the largest recipient of federal small business contracts was Verizon through their subsidiary, I think it was called Telemark, right? So again, nothing in the Small Business Act would allow a Fortune 500 firm to be considered a small business, because the Small Business Act clearly states when determining a company's status as a small business, you must include the number of employees of any subsidiaries or parent companies. The highest small business size standard is 1,500 employees. So clearly, and I think most people would agree with me, a Fortune 500 firm isn't a small business. So the SBA and the government have cheated middle-class small businesses every year for 15 years with creative math, right? They got to arrive at 23%, and they modify these numbers, to achieve that goal. So they want this number to be as small as possible, right, to get to 23%. And so they use an acquisition budget number of sub 400. By the way, they use what's called an exclusionary rule, where they have fabricated a policy to exclude government contracts that they say were too large for small business to get. Well, that's not what the law says. The law says 23% of the total value of all contracts. And then they want this number to be as large as possible to get their 23%, and they do that by including billions in contracts to Fortune 500 firms. That's been widely reported. Again, not a conspiracy theory. The SBA Inspector General, every year for a decade, has reported in the report to Congress the largest problem facing the SBA is that large businesses are getting federal small business contracts. So in 2005, in Report 515, the SBA Inspector General said one of the largest challenges facing the Small Business Administration and the entire federal government today is that large businesses are receiving federal small business procurement awards and agencies receiving credit for these awards. That was 515 in 2005, and every Inspector General for a decade has reiterated that every year since then. Even President Obama said in 2008, it's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants. And just in September, the GAO issued a report that said the SBA was not complying with the laws and the regulations. So again, these are not conspiracy theories. This is President Obama, this is the GAO, this is the SBA Inspector General, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and probably a dozen stories in the biggest newspapers in the country. So I say it's time for Congress to do something to stop the government from cheating small businesses. I view the Small Business Act as the largest economic stimulus program in U.S. history for the middle class. That 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses, right? And it's an economic stimulus program, and it's been repealed. Not with legislation, not by an executive order, but by people within the government coming up with illegal policies that essentially repeal it, and accounting tricks that have cheated the public out of trillions. So I say when you look at this year, small business should have gotten $276 billion for FY 2015. That's very typical. The SBA said $90 billion was 23%. So $186 billion the middle class was defrauded out of just in the last 12 months. And that's gone on, quite frankly, for 15 years. So, with 10 years, that's, 1.8 trillion. So, Lloyd Chapman with the American Small Business League, these aren't conspiracy theories. This is federal law. These are facts that President Obama has acknowledged as a problem. The GAO has acknowledged as a problem. The SBA Inspector General has reported everything for a decade. It's the number one problem at the SBA. And yet no legislation from Congress, no executive order from the president to stop it. And I guess let me close on this. Go out and see who's complaining about this. Go online and look and see, type in SBA fraud and see who's complaining about it. I haven't seen anybody talking about it but the American Small Business League. I challenge anyone to go out there on the internet and find anyone other than Lloyd Chapman and the American Small Business League complaining about the diversion of hundreds of billions of dollars from the middle class. In fact, you won't find any Washington-based small business group mentioning this issue. It's only the American Small Business League. And again, we've got the president on our side. It's time to end the diversion of federal small business contracts to corporate giants, February 2008. We got the GAO, the SBA Inspector General. We got the Small Business Act, says 23% of the total value of all contracts. Says a small business shall be independently owned and have no more than 15 employees. A federal budget of $3.8 trillion. A conservative federal acquisition budget number 1.2 trillion. And the middle class should be receiving $276 billion, and they're getting maybe 10% of that at best. I'm Lloyd Chapman with the American Small Business League. Thanks for watching.